Okay, so today I'm gonna run down two stories for you, both with some real head-scratcher killers. But first, if you dig true crime told in a story format, then you've found your tribe because that's what we're all about and we drop new content once a week. So, if that sounds like your jam, absolutely demolish that like button. Treat it to a brand new, autographed copy of Mr. Ballin's slick new graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live. But remember to tear out a page from each story first. Also, hit that subscribe button and ding that notification bell so you never miss our weekly uploads. Alright, let's dive into these stories. Music. On the morning of September 12, 2007, Ashley Wallace, all of 20 years old, was in her dorm room at Bryant and Stratton College in Buffalo, New York, getting prepped for her very first day of classes. She was stoked. Seriously, this was huge for her. She just moved out on her own for the first time, and, suddenly she felt like a real deal adult. So yeah, big day. She checked herself out in the mirror, made sure her look was on point. She rounded up all her books, her journals, all the essentials. And just as she was about to head out, bang bang bang, a knock on the door. Ashley was kinda puzzled. She hadn't been there long enough for people to know she lived there. So, who'd be paying her a visit? And she definitely hadn't made any plans to hang out with anyone that day. So she's thinking like, who in the world could that be? She walked to the door, swung it open, and was absolutely floored by who was standing there. But that shock quickly morphed into fear. It was two police officers, standing in the hallway, eyes locked on Ashley, and they were wearing some seriously serious faces. Now, Ashley's fear wasn't because she'd been doing anything shady. It was because, before college, she'd been through some heavy-duty trauma. Her father had passed away suddenly from a heart attack when she was only 13, and it had completely knocked the family sideways. Then, her mother remarried, and her stepfather, who had raised her from that point forward, had battled depression. Things seemed to be going okay, but not long after her biological father's sudden death, her stepfather took his own life. So, once again, Ashley and her family were thrown into complete turmoil. In many ways, Ashley hadn't truly recovered from those losses. They were still pretty recent. And now she was out here on her own, trying to navigate adulthood, trying her best to keep it together. But seeing those police officers, she just had this awful gut feeling that they were there to tell her that someone else close to her had died. But when the officers started talking, it became clear they weren't there to deliver news of another death. They were there to talk about her family. They told her they were there to ask her about her father, her biological father, who had passed away 7 years prior. Ashley was all, okay, what do you mean? What do you want to know about my dad? And they laid it on her. Ashley, we exhumed your father. And it turns out he very likely did not die of a heart attack. We suspect he was murdered. About 30 minutes later, after the officers had finally left Ashley's room, she was a total wreck. First, she just learned that her father might have been murdered. But even worse, these officers weren't there to comfort her. They were there to basically interrogate her. They were digging into the family to see if Ashley herself was somehow involved in what happened to her father. She was caught completely off guard. She felt like she was stumbling over her words, totally flustered, which only made her look more suspicious. And every little slip-up she made, the police pounced, drilling her with even more pointed questions. By the end of it, she was sobbing, telling them, I didn't do this. I didn't hurt my dad. I have no idea who would do that. Eventually, the police got up and left, but not before telling Ashley they'd be in touch. And then they were gone. Ashley was left there in her room, totally lost, wondering what to do next. She thought about just sucking it up and going to class, but there was no way she could possibly focus after what she'd just learned and the horrible experience with the police. So Ashley called her mother. Her mother sounded upset the second she picked up, even before Ashley said anything. Ashley quickly learned that her mother had also had a similar experience with the police that day. She'd also been told that her husband had apparently been killed, and they were now investigating her to see if she had something to do with it. So, the two women just cried together on the phone, saying, I don't understand. Who would want to hurt him? It just doesn't make any sense. They've got to be wrong. This is all crazy. Eventually, Ashley's mother, whose name was Stacy, told her to come home. Forget about classes, they could deal with that later. Just come home and be with her family. Ashley agreed that was the best thing to do. So, she grabbed her stuff, left the dorm, hopped in her car, and drove the hour back to her mom's place. When she got there, the first person she saw was her younger sister, Bree, who was 16. Bree's eyes were red, like she'd been crying. And within seconds of them speaking, it was clear that Bree, too, had had a rough run-in with the police that day. It was like the whole family had been thrown into this chaotic nightmare that none of them could wrap their heads around. On the one hand, it was like, who would want to hurt Dad? But on the other, it was like, did this really happen? Is this a mistake? Why did they exhume his body in the first place? What's going on? There was just so much they didn't know. That afternoon, Ashley, her sister Bree, and their mom just holed up in the kitchen. They mostly cried together and talked through this horrible situation. Later in the day, after the tears had dried up a bit and the reality of their complicated situation sunk in, basically, they were all under investigation for the potential murder of their father/husband. They were all stressed about what was coming next. Stacy, the mom, was like, "You know what? I'm getting a drink. Anyone want one?" Bree, being only 16, passed. But Ashley said, "Sure." She was 20, not quite 21, but she was drinking at this point. So, Stacy mixed up some drinks for her and Ashley, and a non-alcoholic drink for Bree. For the rest of the night, the girls just sat in the kitchen, sipping their drinks and trying hard not to let this awful situation completely crush them. The next morning, when Ashley woke up at her mother's house, she had a killer hangover. She'd definitely had some drinks the night before with her mom and sister, but she thought she felt way too hungover for the amount she'd had. She started to wonder if maybe it wasn't just the alcohol, but also the emotional fallout from the horrible thing that happened the day before. As she lay in bed feeling awful, she told herself she needed to get up, go to her classes, try to treat the day like a normal day, and get her life back on track so she'd be ready to deal with the police or whatever else was coming. So, Ashley willed herself out of bed, despite a pounding headache and feeling generally terrible. She took a shower, got herself together, and before long, she was saying bye to her mom and sister and driving back to campus. She still felt awful, but she went to her classes and did her best to focus. It was a monumental effort, but she managed. Finally, at the end of the day during her last class, Ashley started to break out of the hangover fog and feel normal again. By the time she left the lecture hall, she felt good enough to hop back in her car and drive back to her mother's house. That night, just like the night before, she, her sister, and her mom sat in the kitchen, having a cathartic moment together, crying, talking about their dad, sharing memories and theories, and also having a few drinks. Again, Bree stuck to non-alcoholic stuff, but Ashley and her mother drank. The next morning, when Ashley woke up, her head was pounding, even worse than the day before. Except when she opened her eyes, that wasn't the first thing she noticed. The first thing she thought was, "Where am I?" The room looked different. As she looked around, she realized she was in a hospital room. Panic set in, and she started looking around for her family, for anyone she recognized. But no one she knew was there, just two police officers sitting against the wall. When they saw Ashley coming to, they got up and walked over to her. They told her she was incredibly lucky that her mother had found her unresponsive in her bed that morning. Her mother had called an ambulance, and they'd rushed her to the hospital. Luckily, they'd stabilized her, but apparently, she'd been close to complete organ failure. She almost died. It was a miracle she'd gotten there when she did. Before Ashley could ask any questions like, "What was causing my body to shut down? What's going on?" the officers exchanged a look. One of them pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket, handed it to Ashley and said, "You need to explain yourself." It turned out that Ashley's stepfather had taken his own life by drinking antifreeze. At least that was the initial theory. But pretty quickly, investigators started to wonder why someone would choose that method. Drinking antifreeze is slow and painful. It's not a good first choice for suicide. As suspicions grew around the stepfather, investigators thought, okay, well, the biological father died just a few years before, apparently from a heart attack. Maybe we should make sure since we're basically suggesting that someone might have done this to the stepfather. Is it possible someone killed the biological father? So, they exhumed the biological father, and during the autopsy, they discovered antifreeze in his remains. Fast forward to the hospital, where Ashley has woken up. The officers have walked over to her, handed her a note, and told her to explain herself. The note was effectively a confession. The writer said they killed Ashley's biological father, and then Ashley's stepfather. But now, because of the blood on their hands, they were going to take their own life. So, it was a suicide note/confession. And at the bottom, it was signed by Ashley. Except Ashley didn't kill her father or stepfather. Her mother did. Her mother used antifreeze to poison and kill both men. And when the police started poking around, asking questions, what did Ashley's beloved mother do? She tried to poison her own daughter. She laced the alcoholic drinks they were having in her kitchen with painkillers to make it look like Ashley had taken her own life because she felt so guilty about murdering the two men. Except Ashley's mother called the ambulance a little too early. She was feigning that she'd just found her daughter unresponsive. But the ambulance showed up, and the first responders saved Ashley's life by a hair. Apparently, she was within 15 minutes of dying when she arrived at the hospital. Stacy was convicted of 2 murders and the attempted murder of her daughter, and she was sentenced to 51 years in prison. However, she died behind bars in 2016. Music. Around lunchtime on March 31, 2010, a man in his mid-50s named John Schmier was sitting at a table with a bunch of his buddies inside a Hooters restaurant in the small city of York, Pennsylvania. John was a retired eye doctor. He'd had a successful career, made good money. His friends at the table were also pretty successful guys, mid to upper tier professionals with solid careers. But what they were doing that day had nothing to do with work. It was pure pleasure. This group of guys, this specific close-knit group of friends, would meet up a couple of times a month at this particular Hooters. They'd sit at the same table, order the same things. They loved it. It was their little clubhouse. They'd even come up with a name for their group. The Orange Short Society. Hooters has a certain vibe, and if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, basically, the waitresses dress in very revealing clothing, wearing the iconic white tank tops and orange shorts. So, the men were joking that they were the Orange Short Society because of the shorts the women wore. That afternoon, John and the other members of the Orange Short Society sat around chatting and shooting the breeze, just being guys. At some point, John brought up a subject that the rest of the society was used to him bringing up, his ex-wife Monica. His friends knew that John had been married to Monica for 20 years, but they got divorced in 2003, 7 years earlier. Still, Monica was a thorn in John's side because he had to pay her alimony. He understood that came with the territory of divorce, but Monica had made the way John paid her alimony ridiculously cumbersome. John was convinced that it was totally intentional, that she'd made it difficult just to be difficult. She didn't like John and wanted to punish him. Monica required John to withdraw cash from an ATM each week, put it in an envelope, and physically drive it to her house and drop it off. She refused to accept payment any other way. She claimed she didn't have a bank account and couldn't be forced to create one. Either John made these inconvenient cash payments, or he risked not making the payment at all, which would allow her to come after him legally. He was trapped making this trek once a week to hand over cash to his ex-wife, whom he really couldn't stand. Their divorce wasn't super contentious. They just drifted apart. They stopped seeing eye to eye. Monica didn't like the whole Orange Short Society thing. She thought it was scummy, and that John and his buddies were kind of gross for going to the restaurant and making jokes about what the women were wearing and making that part of their identity. She didn't like it, and they drifted apart. That was all it was. But now, it had become this bitter feud between them. At the same time, John and his buddies in the Orange Short Society were sitting in the restaurant and John was ranting about Monica's alimony. Police rushed to Monica's house on the other side of town. Minutes earlier, there had been a 911 call from Monica's house. But when the operator answered, there was no one there. Protocol required them to send first responders to the house to check on whoever had called. Police got to Monica's house, parked, went to the front door, knocked and got no answer. They looked around, saw no sign of forced entry, Nothing unusual. It was a quiet day in the neighborhood. They knocked on the door again. When there was still no answer, they tried the doorknob and it was unlocked. They opened the door and immediately saw Monica. She was dead on the ground with the phone next to her. She'd been shot in the head. Shortly after this discovery, the lead detective, Douglas Demagon, and his team began surveying the crime scene. They quickly found a purse next to Monica's body, and inside was her license. That was how they identified her. They also found a .32 caliber shell casing lying near the body, clearly from the round that struck her in the head and killed her. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of this crime scene had nothing to do with the body. It was all the money they found all over the house, specifically cash in envelopes. The envelopes were in trash cans, drawers, on tables, scattered everywhere. Some were out in the open, some were hidden. There was a lot of money stashed in the house. Demagon and the other investigators wondered if it had been a robbery, and Monica had been killed in the process. But if it was a robbery, why was so much cash out in the open, packaged in envelopes easy to grab? Why was it all still there? It was like no cash had been taken, or at least not very much. Other valuables were still in place. It didn't feel like someone had ransacked the house. It felt like someone had come in and killed Monica. Detective Demagon and his team searched the entire house and couldn't find any sign of forced entry. Whoever came in had either walked in through an unlocked door or window, been let in by Monica, or had a key. Detective Demagon asked the forensics team to sweep the house for DNA to see if they could find something that showed who had been there recently. While that team got started, Demagon continued to walk around the house. He eventually found a Rolodex, which is a big book full of phone numbers and addresses. Flipping through the Rolodex, the detective discovered that Monica had an ex-husband, John Schmier. That evening, Detective Demagon and another investigator drove to John Schmier's house. They walked to the front door and knocked. A moment later, the door opened, and John was standing there, looking very surprised. In homicide cases, the spouse or ex-spouse is always suspect number one. Even though Demagon didn't have any evidence linking John to the crime, he did have the fact that John was her ex-spouse, and therefore was suspicious. Before John could ask any questions, Demagon and his partner introduced themselves and asked if they could come in and speak to him. John said, "Okay, come on in." They walked inside, sat down, and Detective Demagon watched John closely as he told him why they were there. "Your ex-wife has been murdered, and we're here to talk to you about it." Detective Demagon wanted to see if John would have a big reaction or a subdued reaction. The way he reacted could give us a clue as to how involved he might have been in all of this. When Demagon told John that Monica had been shot and killed, John's reaction was huge, almost over the top. His eyes bugged out. He grabbed his chest like he was having a full-blown heart attack. And then he sort of hunched over and started sobbing uncontrollably. But when he straightened up again, the detective noticed something weird. There weren't any tears in John's eyes. It was just this really dramatic, almost theatrical reaction, but Demagon couldn't really tell if it was for real or not. He also didn't have anything to compare it to, no baseline for John's behavior. He didn't know if this kind of reaction was normal for him, but it seemed awfully dramatic, almost like he was putting on an act. So instead of trying to comfort John, Demagon just cut right to the chase and asked, "Where were you earlier this afternoon when the shooting happened?" And when he asked him this, John, who was still sort of rocking back and forth and clutching at his chest and acting super upset, suddenly just stopped, dropped his hands to his sides and casually said, "Oh, I was just hanging out at Hooters with my buddies." A few days later, Detective Demagon paid a visit to the Hooters where John and his friends always met up, and he asked the manager if he could see the security footage from the previous Wednesday, the day Monica was killed. By this point, Demagon had already interviewed all of John's friends who had been at Hooters with him, the so-called Orange Short Society, and he had grilled them about John. Had he really been there? What was he doing? What was he saying? And they all insisted that John had absolutely been there the entire time. They said there was no way he could have slipped out and done anything to Monica. He was with them, they swore he was. Now, they did admit to the detective that John had said some pretty nasty things about Monica. He'd complain about how ticked off he was about having to pay her alimony, and he definitely didn't seem to like her very much. But that was it, they said. That was the extent of his animosity. Now, despite how convincingly these friends insisted that John was there the whole time and couldn't have possibly done it, Demagon still needed proof. He needed to see with his own eyes that John had been where he claimed to be. So, he went to the manager and they pulled up the security footage from the previous Wednesday, and wouldn't you know it, there was John. He walked in, sat down, hung out with his buddies, and stayed there the whole time Monica was being killed. So, at that point, Demagon started to feel like it was pretty unlikely that John had actually gone and killed Monica himself. But given the bad blood between them, John clearly didn't like Monica and hated making those alimony payments. There was obviously some major friction brewing at those Orange Short Society meetings all the time. Maybe it was possible that John, who was pretty well off, had a lot of money. Maybe he hired somebody to do his dirty work for him, a hitman, perhaps. So, over the next week or so, Demagon and his team started looking into this hitman angle. And they found that John had been withdrawing a bunch of cash over the last several weeks, but it seemed to line up with the amount of alimony he owed Monica. They knew he had to deliver the alimony payment in cash, in envelopes, to her, per Monica's instructions. And they found all those envelopes of cash at Monica's house. So, it seemed like that was all he was doing, taking out money to give to Monica. So, John was basically Demagon's only suspect at this point, and there was practically no evidence against him. Demagon knew he really needed to explore other leads, since the John lead was kind of a dead end. So, he and his team started looking into local gang activity and crimes in the area. Could this have just been a random act of violence or something completely unrelated? But after 3 months of searching for any connection anywhere, there wasn't one, and the case pretty much stalled. So, at this point, Demagon decided that the only thing he could do was start from scratch, go back to square one, and re-examine all the evidence. And that included going back and looking at the security footage from Hooters on that Wednesday when the Orange Short Society was there. Demagon sat down and started watching the tape over and over and over again. It was like the 1,000th time he'd looked at this grainy footage. And suddenly, something stood out to him. Something he'd missed all the other times he'd watched it. As he replayed the footage again and again, he realized he was now almost certain about what had happened to Monica. It would turn out that the footage of the Orange Short Society meeting did hold the secret to Monica's murder. John Schmier didn't kill his ex-wife, and he didn't hire a hitman to do it either. He really had nothing to do with her death. The only thing he did do was openly complain at those Orange Short Society meetups about how much he disliked Monica. In particular, he resented having to deliver all that cash to her for his alimony payments. He thought it was a total hassle. But that meant John was regularly telling these guys in the Orange Short Society that Monica was flush with cash, that she was getting tons of cash from him every single week, and that she had all that cash at her house. And eventually, one of the Orange Short Society members, a guy named Tim Jockabe, decided he was going to go to Monica's house and steal that cash. Demagon had been working under the assumption that all the guys who were present at that Wednesday meetup at Hooters, the Orange Short Society, were the entire group, that those were all the members. The way the guys talked about their group was that they all met up every single time, same group, same seats, same restaurant. So, Demagon figured it was the same people every time, the whole group was accounted for. But no, on the day of the murder, one regular member of the Orange Short Society was missing. Tim Jockabe. And that's the discrepancy that Demagon noticed when he watched that footage for the 1,000th time. He realized there was another guy, Tim Jockabe, and he wasn't there. Police later tied Tim to the crime scene with DNA evidence. They determined that Tim went to her house with the intention of robbing her. But when Monica fought back, he shot and killed her and then ran off without taking any money. Tim was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He's currently on death row in Pennsylvania. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you thought of today's episode. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now, but if you want a recommendation from me, I'd say check out this one right here. Alright, see you next time.